believe what I've seen, Laura," Margaret said, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. "He's unloading strange equipment into the house, things that don't belong in a place like Maplewood. I think he's hiding something." Laura sighed. "Margaret, you've got to stop jumping to conclusions. Maybe he has a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this." "Reasonable? A man like that doesn't move into Maplewood without so much as an introduction. It's suspicious," Margaret insisted. She glanced back at the house, her gaze narrowing as Michael stepped outside again. Laura hesitated before replying, "Well, if it's bothering you so much, why not just go introduce yourself? That way you can find out more about him without all this spying." Margaret bristled. "Spying? I'm keeping an eye on things to ensure our neighborhood remains safe. There's a difference." "Whatever you call it," Laura replied lightly. "I think you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Give the man a chance." With that, Laura excused herself, and Margaret hung up the phone. Though her doubts lingered, the evening grew darker and Maplewood's streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. Margaret continued to observe Michael's movements, her vigilance fueled by a growing unease. When she saw him walk out to the edge of his property with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing back and forth, she seized the moment. Margaret dialed the non-emergency line for the local police, her voice measured but firm. "This is Margaret Simmons from Maplewood. I'd like to report a suspicious individual who's just moved into the house across the street from me. He's acting oddly, and I believe he may be a threat to the neighborhood." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Margaret described what she'd seen. His commanding demeanor, the peculiar items being moved into the house, the unfamiliarity of his presence. She concluded, "We're a close-knit community, and this sort of thing just doesn't happen here." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent to check things out, and Margaret hung up, her heart racing. Though she felt justified in her actions, a small voice in the back of her mind questioned whether she'd done the right thing. Within half an hour, a police cruiser pulled into the neighborhood, its lights flashing. Margaret watched from her window, her binoculars in hand, as two officers approached Michael's front door. They knocked, and Michael answered promptly, his expression calm as he greeted them. The conversation was brief. Michael gestured inside his home, inviting the officers to step in. After several minutes they emerged, nodding respectfully to him, before returning to their cruiser. Margaret's curiosity burned as she tried to decipher their expressions. The officers didn't seem alarmed. If anything, they looked almost sheepish. As the cruiser pulled away, Margaret saw one of the officers glance toward her house. She ducked behind the curtain, her heart pounding. What had just happened? Why hadn't they taken any action? Moments later, the doorbell rang. Margaret's stomach tightened. She cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. To her shock, Michael stood on her porch, his tall frame illuminated by the porch light. He held a clipboard in one hand and wore a calm yet commanding expression. Margaret hesitated before opening the door, her voice tight. "Yes?" "Good evening, ma'am," Michael said smoothly, offering a polite smile. "I'm Michael Carter, your new neighbor. I thought I'd come by to introduce myself. I understand there may have been some concerns about my arrival, and I'd like to address them directly." Margaret blinked, momentarily speechless. His tone was courteous but carried an unmistakable authority. She struggled to find her words. Well, it's just unusual for someone to move in without notifying the community." "It's all right." Michael nodded, his expression understanding. "I can appreciate that. I've been busy settling in and preparing for my role here. I apologize if my arrival seemed abrupt." "Your role?" Margaret asked, her curiosity piqued despite herself. Michael extended the clipboard toward her. Yes, ma'am. I'm the newly appointed sheriff for this district. I'll be overseeing law enforcement for the entire area, including Maplewood. The words hit Margaret like a bolt of lightning. Her mouth fell open, and she stared at the badge displayed prominently on the documents in front of her. Sheriff. The man she had called the police on was not just her new neighbor, but the very person responsible for maintaining order in their town. I didn't realize, Margaret stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. I mean, welcome to Maplewood, Sheriff. Michael's smile widened, though his eyes held a flicker of amusement. Thank you, ma'am. I'm looking forward to serving this community. If there's anything I can do to address your concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. Margaret nodded quickly, her mind racing. Of course, Sheriff Carter. I'm sure you'll be a great addition to our neighborhood. As Michael turned to leave, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her chest heaving with a mix of relief and mortification. She had judged him unfairly, allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, and made a fool of herself in the process. Over the following days, Margaret avoided Michael, though she couldn't help but admire the way he quickly integrated into the community. His professionalism and kindness won over even the most skeptical residents. For Margaret, it was a humbling lesson in the dangers of assumptions and an opportunity to reflect on her own actions. Life in Maplewood resumed its tranquil rhythm, though for Margaret, the neighborhood no longer felt quite the same. Words and demeanor, noting the fear and uncertainty that seemed to fuel her concerns. Tom nodded patiently and spoke with a reassuring tone. Thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Simmons. We'll take a look and see if there's anything unusual. For now, please, stay inside your home while we check it out. Margaret nodded, clutching her hands nervously as she stepped back onto her porch. The officers turned and crossed the street, their flashlights cutting through the faint glow of the streetlights. Michael's house stood quiet and still, its warm light illuminating the front windows. Tom knocked firmly on the door, and after a few moments, it opened. Michael appeared in the doorway, his tall frame and confident presence filling the space. He looked at the officers curiously, but with no sign of alarm. "Good evening, officers," he greeted them, his voice calm and steady. "How can I help you?" Tom stepped forward slightly, maintaining a polite but professional demeanor. "Good evening, sir. We received a call from a concerned neighbor about some activity at your house. Would you mind if we asked you a few questions?" Michael's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. Come in." He stepped aside, gesturing for the officers to enter. Inside, the house was a mix of organized chaos and elegance. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, some partially opened to reveal books, framed photographs, and personal belongings. A grand piano stood in the corner of the living room, its polished surface reflecting the overhead lights. On the dining table lay various tools, papers, and what appeared to be a set of blueprints. Michael motioned toward the living room, inviting the officers to sit. "I just moved in today, so things are a bit messy," he explained with a slight smile. "What seems to be the concern?" Tom glanced around the room before responding. "We received a report about some unusual activity. Your neighbor mentioned large boxes and a perceived air of secrecy. We're here to ensure there's nothing to worry about." Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I see. Well, the boxes contain my belongings, furniture, books, and some equipment for work. Nothing secretive, I assure you." Mike, the younger officer, pointed toward the table. "These tools and blueprints, what are they for?" Michael's expression lightened as he walked over to the table and picked up one of the blueprints. "I'm an engineer by profession. These are plans for a community project I'm working on. It's a part of my role as the new sheriff of this town." The officers exchanged surprised glances. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You're the new sheriff." Michael nodded, extending a hand to Tom. "Michael Carter. I was appointed last week. Today's move was a bit sudden, but I'm excited to be here and get to know the community." The tension in the room eased immediately. Tom shook Michael's hand, a smile spreading across his face. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Sheriff Carter. Welcome to Maplewood." Michael smiled warmly. "Thank you. I understand neighbors might be curious or even cautious about someone new. I'd like to address any concerns and build a positive relationship with everyone here." Meanwhile, Emily had been quietly observing, her respect for Michael growing as she took in his composed and approachable demeanor. She spoke up. "I think the neighbor may have misunderstood your activities. It's a quiet neighborhood, and they're not used to sudden changes." Michael nodded. "I completely understand. I'll make it a priority to introduce myself to everyone in the coming days." Tom stood, his tone lighter now. "We'll let Mrs. Simmons know there's no cause for concern. I'm sure she'll be relieved to hear that you're not only her neighbor but also the sheriff." As the officers made their way back to Margaret's house, Emily glanced back at Michael's home, reflecting on how quickly assumptions could escalate. They approached Margaret's door, and she opened it immediately, her face filled with anxious anticipation. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom smiled reassuringly. "Mrs. Simmons, you have nothing to worry about. The new resident is Michael Carter, and he's the recently appointed sheriff of our town. He was just unpacking his belongings." Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. "The sheriff?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, that's correct," Tom confirmed. "He's looking forward to meeting the community and has nothing but good intentions for the neighborhood." Margaret stepped back, her mind racing as she processed the information. A mixture of relief and embarrassment washed over her. "I see," she murmured. I didn't know." Tom gave her a kind smile. "It's understandable to be cautious, but now that you know, I hope you'll give him a warm welcome. He seems like a great addition to the community." As the patrol car pulled away from Maplewood, the neighborhood returned to its peaceful state. Michael sat in his living room, sipping a cup of coffee, reflecting on the evening's events. Across the street, Margaret sat in her living room staring out the window, her thoughts filled with both regret and a newfound curiosity about the man she had misjudged. Expression wavered, wondering if she had overreacted or if there had been genuine cause for concern. She sighed deeply, her thoughts swirling with doubt and guilt. "All right, Mrs. Simmons," Tom said, his tone calm and reassuring. "We'll take a look. Please stay here while we handle it." Margaret nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on Michael's house as if expecting something to justify her fears. The three officers crossed the street, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet night. Through the brightly lit windows, they observed Michael inside, organizing his belongings. He moved back and forth, occasionally pausing to inspect items on the floor. "This looks like a regular evening for someone who just moved in," Emily murmured, her voice neutral, though she remained alert. "Maybe," Tom replied cautiously, "but we can't jump to conclusions. You never know what might come up." Mike knocked lightly on the wooden door, the sound firm but not aggressive. The three waited, their eyes scanning the house's interior as Michael's silhouette paused and turned toward the door. "Be ready," Tom whispered, his expression serious but composed. "We don't know what we're walking into." The door opened slowly, and Michael stepped out, his demeanor calm and self-assured. Dressed in a deep blue sweater and jeans, he exuded an approachable confidence. "Good evening, officers," Michael greeted them, his voice warm and steady. "How can I help you?" Tom stepped forward, maintaining a professional stance. Mike stood slightly behind him, his seasoned gaze taking in every detail. Emily lingered nearby, her sharp eyes noting Michael's relaxed yet poised body language. "Good evening, sir," Tom said evenly. "We received a call from a neighbor reporting some suspicious activity related to your move. We're here to check and make sure everything is all right." Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression briefly surprised before softening into a chuckle. "I see. I just moved in today and might have caused a bit of a stir. I'm unpacking and organizing." "Nothing to worry about." Mike glanced past him into the house. The living room was filled with neatly arranged boxes and partially set up furniture. Everything appeared orderly and consistent with someone settling in. "Are you moving in alone?" Mike asked, his tone gentle but inquisitive. Michael nodded with a slight smile. "Yes, just me. I'm still getting everything in place. Honestly, this is a fresh start for me, and I'm looking forward to getting to know the neighborhood." As he spoke, Emily squinted slightly, trying to place his familiar face. A faint sense of recognition tugged at her memory, but she couldn't immediately recall where she had seen him before. "Where did you live before this?" Tom inquired, his tone professional yet tinged with curiosity. Michael gestured toward the interior of the house. "I came from the next city over. A new job brought me here. Maplewood seemed like the perfect place to settle down." Tom and Mike exchanged a subtle look, a shared understanding passing between them. Standing slightly behind, Emily's eyes widened as recognition dawned. The name Michael Carter surfaced in her mind, bringing clarity. "You're—" Emily began, her voice betraying her surprise. Michael turned to her, his expression friendly. "That's right. I'm Michael Carter," he said, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I'll be taking over as the town's new police chief starting next week." Tom and Mike froze momentarily before breaking into relieved laughter, their tension evaporating. "So, you're the new chief we've been hearing about?" Tom said, shaking Michael's hand firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Mike followed suit, his grin broad. "We've heard about you from the top brass, but we didn't expect to meet you like this. Looks like we've been investigating our new boss." Michael chuckled, his deep voice resonating with good humor. "That's all right. I appreciate your professionalism. I'm looking forward to working with a team as dedicated as yours." Emily observed quietly, a smile touching her lips as the earlier tension gave way to camaraderie. Michael Carter was not only a capable leader, but also approachable and grounded. Meanwhile, across the street, Margaret watched the scene unfold from her window, her expression puzzled. The laughter and handshakes she witnessed did not align with the tense confrontation she had envisioned. "What's happening?" she muttered, unable to reconcile her assumptions with the reality before her. Moments later, as the officers prepared to leave, Michael stepped onto the porch. Margaret, unable to contain her curiosity, ventured closer. She overheard his voice, calm and authoritative. "Thank you for stopping by to check on everything," he said. "I understand the importance of keeping the neighborhood safe." Tom nodded, his smile genuine. "It's great to meet you, Chief. We're looking forward to working with you." Margaret froze as the words registered. "The police chief?" she whispered, stunned. Michael noticed her approach and turned to her, his demeanor polite but firm. "Mrs. Simmons?" He addressed her directly. "I'm guessing this call came from you, am I right?" Margaret's face flushed, her voice faltering. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't know." Michael raised a hand gently, his expression understanding but resolute. "I appreciate your concern for the community's safety," he said evenly. "But in the future, I hope you'll consider speaking with me directly. Open communication helps avoid unnecessary misunderstandings." Margaret's head lowered, her embarrassment evident. "I'm sorry," she murmured. I just wanted to keep Maplewood safe. Michael nodded, his tone softening. I want the same, Mrs. Simmons. Let's move forward with trust and understanding. As the officers departed, Margaret remained rooted in place, waves of regret washing over her. Laura, her closest neighbor, approached quietly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. We've all made mistakes, Margaret, Laura said gently. But let's learn to trust people a little more before jumping to conclusions. Margaret nodded silently, her thoughts churning. She glanced back at Michael's house, now illuminated with the warm glow of acceptance and community. Margaret remained on Michael's front lawn, staring at his house. The lights inside still glowed warmly, casting soft shadows against the windows. She could see Michael's silhouette moving about, probably still arranging his belongings. She took a deep breath, but the weight in her chest refused to lift. The events of the evening played on an endless loop in her mind. Her call to the police, the officer's investigation, and the moment she discovered who Michael truly was. What have I done? She whispered to herself, a heavy knot of regret tightening in her chest. The officer's parting words replayed in her head, clear and unwavering. He's the new police chief of the town. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Though it was meant to explain and diffuse the situation, it felt like a subtle rebuke that left Margaret feeling exposed and judged. She actually felt joy when Margaret saw her, taken aback by the warning. Laura stood quietly by her side, her expression a mix of concern and quiet empathy. Margaret, you acted out of concern for the neighborhood, Laura said gently. But sometimes we need to take more time to understand things before we act. Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't find the words. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on Michael's house, the warmth of its light contrasting with the storm brewing inside her. She stood there, rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her: shame, confusion, guilt. The evening silence was so profound she could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the soft breeze, but her mind was far too preoccupied to notice. I was wrong, Margaret admitted quietly, the realization washing over her like a tidal wave. Completely wrong. She remembered Michael's composed response, his words steady yet kind. I genuinely appreciate your concern for community safety, but in the future, I hope you'll speak with me directly. Those words resonated deeply, a reflection of the haste and prejudice that had fueled her actions. She replayed the encounter in her mind. Michael had shown no anger, no frustration, only a calm grace that left her both humbled and astonished. How could he be so understanding when I was the one who put him in such a position? She wondered, guilt gnawing at her. The memory of his steady gaze, his voice calm and reassuring, lingered in her thoughts. As the night deepened and the lights in Michael's house began to dim one by one, Margaret remained standing there, unwilling to leave. Her eyes swept across the familiar neighborhood, the houses, the trees, the well-worn paths. This was the community she thought she knew so well. Yet tonight had revealed how limited her understanding truly was. Under the faint glow of a nearby street lamp, Margaret's weariness was evident. Her shoulders drooped, and her face bore the weight of an internal battle. If only I'd been more patient, she thought. If only I'd taken the time to understand, instead of rushing to conclusions. Then, a glimmer of realization began to take shape. Michael wasn't just another neighbor. He had come to Maplewood with a purpose, not just to live here, but to contribute to the community, to lead it towards something better. His poise, his ability to handle the situation with grace, had taught her a profound lesson. Maplewood didn't just need protection. It needed understanding and trust. Margaret's perspective shifted. She began to see the evening not just as a mistake, but as an opportunity, a chance to grow, to change. If Michael can extend forgiveness, then so can I, she resolved, a quiet determination forming within her. Just as Margaret turned to leave, the front door of Michael's house opened again. This time a graceful woman stepped out, followed by a cheerful little girl who looked to be about 10 years old. The child's braided hair and bright smile caught Margaret's attention. "Margaret, let me introduce my family," Michael said warmly, stepping onto the porch. "This is my wife Samantha, and our daughter Chloe. They've just finished unpacking and wanted to come out and say hello." Samantha offered a kind smile, extending her hand. "Hello, Mrs. Simmons. It's a pleasure to meet you. Michael has mentioned what a lovely neighborhood this is, and we're excited to be a part of it." Margaret hesitated, momentarily taken aback by Samantha's genuine kindness. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Carter. It's very nice to meet you and your family," she managed to stammer, struggling to mask her lingering embarrassment. Chloe stepped forward, her youthful enthusiasm lighting up the moment. "Hi, I'm Chloe. We just moved in and I can't wait to meet everyone. I love drawing and playing soccer. This neighborhood is so pretty. I hope we can be friends." Her lively energy immediately softened the atmosphere. Margaret couldn't help but smile faintly at Chloe's innocent excitement. From across the street, Jessica Brown, a younger neighbor, approached, drawn by the commotion. She crouched to Chloe's level. "Hi, Chloe. I love drawing too. Maybe we can draw together sometime?" Chloe's eyes sparkled. "Really? That sounds amazing," she exclaimed, bouncing slightly on her toes. Samantha turned back to Margaret, her gentle smile unwavering. "We're eager to build good relationships here. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything." As Margaret watched this family, so warm and open, a wave of relief began to wash over her. They weren't at all what she had imagined. This was a family ready to be part of the community, ready to connect and make a difference. More neighbors, drawn by the warm interaction, began to approach. An older gentleman from next door extended his hand to Michael. "Welcome to Maplewood, Mr. Carter, if you ever need anything. I'm just next door." Another neighbor chimed in. "Your daughter is adorable. I'm sure my kids will love playing with her." Michael responded with a warm smile, shaking hands with each neighbor. "Thank you all. We're truly happy to be here." Chloe continued to charm everyone around her with her spirited conversation, and soon the initial hesitations among the neighbors began to fade. The Carters' openness bridged the divide, melting away the lingering tension. Margaret stepped back slightly, observing the scene unfold. She exhaled deeply, a sense of calm beginning to settle over her. Turning to Michael, she finally found the courage to speak. "Michael," she began softly, "I think I was wrong about you. Welcome to the neighborhood." Michael turned to her, his smile sincere. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. I look forward to being good neighbors." Breathed, feeling the weight of her earlier assumptions lift slightly. "You're right," she said softly. "A community is like a garden. It needs nurturing, understanding, and effort from everyone." Michael smiled warmly, sensing a shift in Margaret's demeanor. "Exactly, Mrs. Simmons, and I believe Maplewood has the potential to be a truly flourishing garden, especially with neighbors who care as much as you do." For the first time, Margaret felt that his words were not just polite, but sincere. She saw in Michael a kindred spirit, a person who valued the neighborhood as much as she did, albeit with a different perspective. As they stood there, Chloe bounded out of the house, her sketchbook in hand. "Mrs. Simmons," she called brightly, holding up a drawing. "Look, I drew this for you." Margaret bent down to take the picture. a colorful depiction of Maplewood with happy neighbors waving to one another, children playing, and vibrant gardens. The simplicity and warmth of the drawing brought a lump to her throat. "It's beautiful, Chloe," Margaret said, her voice wavering slightly. "You have a real talent." Chloe beamed, and Samantha, who had just stepped outside with a tray of lemonade, joined them. "She's been working on it all morning," Samantha said with a smile. "She wanted to capture what she loves about the neighborhood." Margaret looked at Samantha, then at Michael, and finally at Chloe. In their faces she saw a family genuinely invested in Maplewood, not as outsiders but as a part of its fabric. "Thank you for this," Margaret said, holding the drawing close. "It means a lot to me." Samantha poured a glass of lemonade and handed it to Margaret. "You're always welcome here, Mrs. Simmons," she said warmly. Margaret sipped the lemonade, feeling a surprising sense of belonging in the Carters' presence. "Please call me Margaret," she said, her smile growing. Michael chuckled. "Margaret it is then, and you can call me Michael." The small moment felt monumental to Margaret, a step forward, a bridge over the gap she'd unknowingly created. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself spending more time with the Carters. She joined Samantha and Chloe in planting flowers along the community park's borders, an initiative Michael spearheaded to beautify the area. She even attended a town meeting Michael organized to discuss ways to enhance neighborhood safety and connectivity. At every turn, Margaret witnessed Michael's genuine dedication. He wasn't just integrating into Maplewood, he was enriching it. His calm demeanor, thoughtful ideas, and ability to listen won over even the most skeptical residents. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret and Michael worked side by side planting a new row of tulips, she glanced at him and said, "You know, Michael, I think you're exactly what this neighborhood needed." Michael paused, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked at her with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Margaret. But I believe this neighborhood has always had what it needs. It just takes all of us working together to bring it out." Margaret nodded, understanding the truth in his words. For so long she'd seen herself as the protector of Maplewood, but she now realized that true protection came from connection and collaboration. As the tulips began to bloom in vibrant shades of red and yellow, Margaret felt a similar transformation within herself. The walls she'd built around her heart were crumbling, replaced by bridges of trust and understanding. One evening, as the neighborhood gathered in the park to celebrate the successful completion of the community garden, Margaret stood to address the crowd. "I want to thank the Carters for reminding us all what it means to be a community," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Their kindness, patience, and willingness to contribute have shown us that our strength lies in our unity." The crowd erupted in applause, with Michael and his family at the center, their faces lit with gratitude. As Margaret sat down, Samantha leaned over and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret. Your words mean the world to us." Then, Margaret smiled, her heart full. "No, Samantha, thank you. Your family has brought out the best in Maplewood. And in me." As the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow over the community, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She realized that Maplewood was no longer just a neighborhood of houses and streets. It was a living, breathing community where understanding and kindness had the power to heal and unite. Michael's calm gaze met Margaret's as she took a steadying breath, her words coming slowly but with deep sincerity. "Mr. Michael," she began, her voice low but resolute, "you may not know this, but I've been here for nearly 30 years. Maplewood has always been a safe, familiar place to me. When I saw a change coming, when I saw you, I felt uneasy, even afraid." Michael listened intently, his expression open and understanding. "I can understand that," he said softly. "Change, whether good or bad, often brings uncertainty, but it can also be a chance for growth, learning, and building something better." Margaret nodded, her eyes brightening slightly. "Yes, you're right. After everything that's happened, I've realized how rigid my thinking was. I didn't give you a fair chance and let my fears cloud my judgment. That wasn't fair to you, or to anyone." Michael's smile was warm and reassuring. "Mrs. Simmons, what's important is that we're having this conversation now. Being able to reflect and grow is what really matters." Margaret felt a wave of relief and a newfound energy stirring within her. She shifted the subject. "About the community activity you mentioned, do you have any specific plans in mind?" Michael glanced toward the small park at the corner, then back to her. "I was thinking we could organize a cleanup and restoration day for the park. It's where the kids often play, but it's been neglected lately. With some effort, we could bring it back to life." Margaret's face lit up at the suggestion. "That's a wonderful idea. I remember when that park was beautiful. Perhaps we could invite everyone in the neighborhood to join us. Some families might even donate plants or help repaint the benches." "Impossible to do that now." Michael chuckled, his enthusiasm contagious. "Exactly. If we work together, we won't just transform the park. We'll bring the neighborhood closer too." Hearing his words, Margaret felt a deep sense of optimism. She could already envision neighbors laughing, sharing stories, and working side by side. "I'll start making a list of households and drafting invitations," she said with determination. "This will show everyone what we can accomplish together." The greasiness off the steaks enveloped her. Michael's gratitude was evident as he nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. Your passion and dedication are inspiring. With you on board, this project will be a success." Margaret laughed softly, the tension she'd carried for weeks finally easing. "I think this is my chance to make things right, to show that I've learned something important. You've taught me to look beyond my fears and to embrace change." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And you've taught me something too, Mrs. Simmons. That willingness to admit mistakes and grow is what makes a community strong." A week later, the small park buzzed with energy as neighbors of all ages gathered under the soft spring sunlight. Children, parents, and elders came equipped with tools, plants, and smiles. The air filled with a sense of purpose and camaraderie. Margaret and Michael took on leadership roles, guiding volunteers and ensuring tasks were smoothly distributed. Groups of adults repainted the weathered benches in cheerful shades of yellow, blue, and white, while others planted vibrant flowers like marigolds, roses, and lavender. The park was transforming into a vibrant and inviting space. On the other side, children eagerly picked up litter, proudly carrying fabric bags filled with their finds. Chloe, Michael's daughter, led a group of kids in a chalk art project, drawing whimsical flowers and houses along the walkways. Margaret stood beside Michael, watching the scene with pride. "Look at this," she said, her voice brimming with emotion. "With just a bit of effort and unity, we've created something remarkable." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the park with satisfaction. "This is the power of togetherness," he replied. "I'm so grateful to be a part of this." The work continued, with neighbors sharing stories and laughter. Long-time residents reminisced about the park's early days, while newer ones brainstormed ideas for future gatherings. Bonds deepened, and the spirit of community grew stronger with each passing moment. As the project neared completion, Michael stood at the center of the park and clapped his hands to gather everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming today," he said, his voice carrying warmth and conviction. "Together, We've not only revived this park but also strengthened the ties that make Maplewood special. Let's continue to work together to make this neighborhood a place we're all proud to call home." Applause filled the air, and Margaret couldn't hide her smile. She approached Michael quietly, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "Michael, you've brought something truly special to Maplewood. Thank you for showing us what it means to build a community." At the end of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael and Margaret planted a lavender bush in the corner of the park. The small plant, vibrant and fragrant, became a symbol of peace and harmony. Beside it, a plaque was placed that read, "Open your heart, for unity begins with understanding." The message resonated deeply, serving as a reminder to all Maplewood residents that empathy and trust are the foundations of a thriving community. As neighbors lingered to admire their work, the park radiated warmth and joy. Margaret stood apart for a moment, taking in the transformed scene. She realized this wasn't just about a park. It was about breaking down barriers and embracing the richness of diversity. From that day forward, Maplewood wasn't just a quiet neighborhood. It became a vibrant community, united by trust, empathy, and a shared vision for the future.